I found you, she whispered, her fingers trembling against the worn leather patch. You're him. Your dad's best friend. The entire cafe went silent. The man with the gray beard didn't move, didn't breathe, because nobody should have known that patch existed. Nobody except the man he buried in his heart 20 years ago. If this story moves you, please subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment below and tell us what city you're watching from. I want to see just how far this story traveled. The storm had been building for 3 hours before it finally broke. Emily Carter felt it in her bones the way she always felt things quietly. Then, all at once, she had driven 412 miles that day, stopping twice for gas and once to cry in a McDonald's parking lot off Interstate 40. Because she was 20 years old and she was exhausted, and she had been chasing a name for years. She still wasn't sure she had the right man. Jackson Walker. She had written that name in 12 different notebooks. She had Googled it 400 times. She had called 7 different Jackson Walkers across 5 states, and every single one of them had either hung up on her or told her she had the wrong number. She had mailed letters to 2 of them. Neither wrote back. But this one, the one whose name had appeared in her father's handwriting, pressed into the yellowed pages of an old letter with so much force that the pen had nearly torn through, this one was different. She could feel it. She pushed through the door of the Crossroads Diner, and the bell above her head announced her arrival to everyone and no one. The place smelled like coffee and fried onions and something older, something that lived in the walls. There was a jukebox near the back that was playing Merle Haggard low enough that you had to strain to hear it, and the fluorescent light above the counter flickered every few seconds like it was trying to send a message in code. Emily stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. There were maybe 9 people inside. A couple sharing a slice of pie near the window. A trucker on his 3rd refill at the counter. 2 older women trading gossip over sweet tea. And then against the far wall, mostly in shadow, a man sitting alone. Gray beard, wide shoulders, a black leather vest worn soft with age. One hand wrapped around a coffee mug, the other resting flat on the table, like he was steadying himself against something nobody else could feel. Emily's heart stopped, not because of his size, not because of the beard or the vest or the way he held himself, like a man who had spent decades deciding exactly how much space he was going to take up in a room and had settled on all of it. It stopped because of the patch. It was on the left chest of the vest, faded to the point where most people probably wouldn't know what they were looking at. But Emily knew. She had memorized every detail of it from the photograph. Her father kept folded in his wallet the photograph she had found tucked inside the lining of his old jacket 3 years ago. 2 months after they buried him. She knew the shape. She knew the colors, even faded. She knew the way the stitching curled at the bottom edge where someone had repaired it once. Years ago, with slightly different thread. Her legs moved before her brain gave permission. She crossed the diner in 9 steps, and she was aware of nothing, not the couple who looked up from their pie, not the trucker who swiveled on his stool, not the waitress who paused mid-pour at the counter, because her entire world had contracted to that patch and the man wearing it and the 3 years of searching that had led her to this moment. He sensed her coming. She could tell by the way his head lifted slightly, the way his hand tightened around the coffee mug. Men like him always sensed things before they arrived. But he wasn't prepared for what came next. Emily reached out her hand and touched the patch. She wasn't being disrespectful. She wasn't being aggressive. Her touch was so gentle it was almost reverent. The way you might touch the name on a headstone. The way you might touch something you'd been afraid didn't exist. Her fingers traced the edges of the emblem, and her eyes filled. And she said the words she had practiced in the car for 100 miles and still didn't know how to say. I found you, she whispered. You're him. Your dad's best friend. Jack Walker had not cried in 11 years. He knew this because the last time had been at a roadside memorial in New Mexico on a Tuesday in October, and he had sat there for 2 hours in the dirt and then driven away and made himself a promise he intended to keep. He almost broke it right there in the Crossroads Diner. He pulled back instead. Instinct. Defense. He put 6 inches between himself and the girl, and he looked at her, really looked at her, and something moved in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. She had Daniel's eyes. Not the color. The color was all wrong. Hers lighter than Daniel's had been. But the expression, that particular mixture of stubbornness and fear and something that refused to give up, that was Daniel Carter, down to the cellular level. Who are you? His voice came out lower than he intended. Rougher. Emily, she didn't wipe her eyes. She let them stand there, those tears, like she wasn't ashamed of them. Emily Carter. Daniel Carter was my father. The mug in Jack's hand hit the table harder than he meant it to. Danny's daughter, he said. Not a question. He wasn't sure what it was. Yes. Her chin tilted up a fraction. He talked about you. He always talked about you, he said. Her voice cracked, and she pressed her lips together for just a second, and then she pushed through it. He said, if I was ever in trouble, if I ever needed someone I could trust completely, I should find Jack Walker. He said you'd know what to do. The Merle Haggard song ended. The jukebox made a clicking sound and went quiet. In the sudden absence of music, the diner felt like it was holding its breath. Jack studied her face for a long moment. How'd you find me? It took 3 years. She said it without drama, like it was just a fact. Letters, photos, club records. A woman in Albuquerque who knew someone who knew someone. A man in Oklahoma City who remembered a name. It wasn't fast, no, Jack said slowly. I imagine it wasn't. He pulled the chair across from him, away from the table with his boot. An invitation. The smallest one he knew how to make. Emily sat down. She ordered coffee because her hands needed something to do. Jack watched her wrap both hands around the mug, the same way he wrapped his, the same unconscious gesture, and it did something strange to him. Seeing Daniel's habits living on in this girl who hadn't existed the last time Jack and Daniel had sat across from each other at a table. When did he pass? Jack asked. 3 years ago. March. She looked down at her coffee. Heart failure. He was 51. Jack was quiet for a moment. I didn't know. I figured. She looked up. There wasn't really anyone to tell. Mom left when I was 7. It was just the two of us. And then it was just me. The weight of that sentence filled the space between them. Just me. 20 years old and just her. He never mentioned you had a daughter, Jack said. Something moved across her face, a flinch that she controlled quickly. He kept a lot of things separate. He was good at that. She paused. I found your name in his letters. Old ones from the 90s. He wrote about you like. She stopped, started again. He wrote about you the way people write about the person who saved their life. Jack stared at the table. He exaggerated, he said finally. I don't think he did. Her voice was quiet but absolutely certain. He described the night in detail. Outside Flagstaff. 1994. Jack went very still. He wrote about that night? His voice had changed in some way that Emily couldn't fully name but felt immediately. 6 pages, she said. Front and back. He described everything, he said. She reached into the bag on her lap and pulled out a worn envelope. Its edges soft with handling. He said, and I'm quoting, Jack Walker is the only man who ever put himself between me and something that would have killed me. And he did it without being asked and without wanting anything in return. That is the rarest thing. That is the thing I will never forget. She set the envelope on the table between them, but didn't push it forward. She let it sit there. Jack looked at it for a long time without touching it. That was a long time ago, he said. I know. Things were complicated with Danny. I know that too. You don't. Actually, he said it without meanness. You know the version he wrote down. There's more. Emily nodded slowly. That's partly why I'm here. The letters, they stopped explaining things at a certain point. He wrote about a falling out. He didn't say what it was. He just said he made a choice he thought was right and lost everything because of it. Including you. She searched his face. I want to understand what happened to my father. I want to understand who he really was. Not the version I had at home. The quiet man who worked at the hardware store and didn't talk about his past. The real one. Jack was quiet for a long time. Outside, the storm was doing serious work now. Rain cracked against the windows in steady sheets. and the couple at the window table gathered their things and left, and the trucker put down exact change and followed them out, and within 20 minutes it was just Emily and Jack and the waitress who had the good sense to refill their coffees without being asked and then make herself scarce. Your father, Jack said at last, was the most loyal man I ever knew. And loyalty, in my experience, is the thing that most often gets people killed. Emily's hands tightened around her mug. What does that mean? It means his story is complicated. It means there are things you're going to hear that are going to be hard. I survived hard. He looked at her again with that same searching quality. Something in him seemed to make a decision. Yeah, he said, I can see that. He didn't tell her everything that night. He wasn't built that way, not built, to open a vault that had been sealed for decades in the middle of a diner while a storm wrecked itself against the windows. But he told her enough to make her stay. He told her that Daniel Carter had ridden with the chapter out of Phoenix for 7 years, from 1989 to 1996, that in those 7 years he had become the kind of man that everyone wanted beside them when things went sideways. The kind of man you made promises to and kept them, because Daniel Carter kept every promise he'd ever made, and it made you want to be the same. He told her that he and Daniel had been road brothers from the first month, that they had covered each other's backs across 4 states through situations that Jack was not going to describe in detail to Daniel's 20-year-old daughter, and through quieter things, 2 flat tires in the desert, hospital waiting rooms, one brutal winter in Colorado where they'd been stranded for 4 days and had run out of everything except bad jokes and an inexhaustible supply of things to argue about. He could argue about anything, Jack said, and something crossed his face that Emily had no word for, yet grief and affection and humor all tangled together. I mean anything. One time we spent 6 hours on the side of Route 66 arguing about the correct way to make chili. 6 hours. On the side of the road. Emily laughed and then looked surprised that she'd laughed, and Jack's expression shifted slightly. You have his laugh, he said. He said it like he hadn't meant to. She looked down at her coffee. That's the first time anyone's ever told me I have anything of his. The silence stretched between them. He had a whole other life, she said quietly. Before me. Before my mother. A whole life I never knew about. I used to find that upsetting. I used to be angry about it, like, why didn't he tell me? Why did he keep all of it locked away like some secret he was embarrassed of? She paused. But then I found the letters and the photographs. And I started to understand that it wasn't embarrassment. It was protection, Jack said. She looked at him. He was protecting you, Jack said. That was always Danny's logic. Keep the walls up. Keep the people he cared about on the safe side of them. He thought that was the loving thing to do. Was it? Jack considered the question seriously. The way she'd asked it. Parts of it were. Parts of it cost him more than it cost anyone else. He was good at paying costs. Emily reached into her bag again. She pulled out a small cardboard box, battered at the corners, sealed with a strip of tape that had been opened and resealed more than once. She set it on the table between them with the same deliberate care she'd set the envelope. He left me this, she said. I've opened it. I know what's in it. But there are things inside that I don't fully understand. Photographs of people I can't identify. Names he wrote down that I can't trace. And one note at the bottom, underneath everything else. She watched Jack's face. It had your name on it. Just your name and a phone number that turned out to be disconnected. And underneath that, she swallowed, he wrote, he will know what to do. He always did. Tell him I never stopped. Jack's jaw worked. Never stopped what? Emily asked. Her voice was steady, but her eyes were bright. That's what I can't figure out. Never stopped what? He looked at the box. He looked at her. He looked at the rain hammering the windows. Trusting me, Jack said, and his voice was not steady at all. He never stopped trusting me. They stayed in that diner for 2 hours while the storm ran itself out. Jack ordered food, eventually, not because he was hungry, but because he kept looking at them with the worried expression of a woman who understood that some conversations needed anchoring to something ordinary, and a plate of eggs and toast counted. Emily ate half his toast without asking. He noticed, but didn't say anything about it. She asked questions, and he answered them carefully, selectively, but honestly. She had a way of listening that Daniel had too, completely still, giving her full attention to whatever was being said in a way that made you feel that what you were saying mattered. It was an uncommon skill. It made you want to keep talking. He told her about the chapter. He told her about the early years, the good years, before things got complicated. He talked about cross-country runs that lasted 3 weeks, about breakdowns and barroom arguments, and the particular silence of riding through the desert at 5 in the morning when the world was the color of charcoal and the road was all yours. He talked about what it meant to ride with people who had your back, not because it was convenient, but because it was who they were. He did not talk yet about the end, about 1996, about the thing that had happened that year that had separated him and Daniel and left Jack riding alone for the better part of a decade. Emily didn't push, but he could feel her awareness of the gap, that careful professional patience she was applying to the conversation, giving him room to get to it on his own time. She was 20 years old, he reminded himself. She was 20 years old, and she had driven over 400 miles alone in a storm to find him. And she was sitting across from him with her coffee and her careful patience, and she was completely unlike anyone he had expected. "Can I ask you something?" she said during a lull. "You've been asking me things for 2 hours. A different kind of something." He gestured. "Go ahead." "When you heard his name just now when I said it, outside, when I said Daniel Carter, what did you feel?" Jack was quiet for a moment. "What kind of question is that?" "An honest one." He turned his coffee mug in his hands, like someone opened a door that I'd spent a lot of time making sure was closed. She nodded slowly, like that was exactly the answer she'd expected. "He described you the same way," she said, "in the letters. He said being around you was like standing next to an open window, like you let air into things." Jack stared at her. "He wrote that twice, in different letters, different years, same image." She met his eyes. "He didn't forget you either. I just wanted you to know that." At 11:15, the rain finally eased. The waitress brought their check, and Jack paid it without discussion. Emily started to object, and he gave her a look that Daniel would have recognized, the one that meant the matter was closed and revisiting. It was a waste of everyone's time, and she closed her mouth. They stood in the parking lot. The air smelled like wet asphalt and cedar. The clouds were breaking up overhead, and through the gaps, stars were starting to appear. Emily had her bag over her shoulder and her car keys in her hand, and she was looking at him with that searching expression again, the one that was all Daniel, the one that made Jack's chest feel like it had something in it that needed more space than he'd allocated. "There's a motel about a mile up the road," he said. "Clean, cheap, safe. Not fancy. I've been sleeping in my car," she said. "I'm not picky. Don't sleep in your car." She almost smiled. "Is that an order?" "It's a recommendation." She looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "He was right about you. I can tell already." Jack didn't ask what she meant. He wasn't sure he could handle the answer right now. "Drive careful," he said. "Road's gonna be wet. I know how to drive in rain." "I know you do. I'm saying it anyway." She did smile then, quick, real, and so completely her father that Jack felt it in places he'd thought were finished feeling things. She turned and walked toward her car. She was 3 feet away when he said, "Emily." She stopped, turned. "The number in the box," he said. "The disconnected one. That was my old number. I changed it in 2006 when I moved out of Arizona. There were reasons." She waited. "I'm going to give you the new one," he said, "in case you need it. In case anything. In case you need it." He said it twice, because the first time he wasn't sure who he was saying it to her, or the door that he'd spent a long time keeping closed, which was now apparently open. She saved the number in her phone, without commenting on the fact that it was the first time in years anyone had offered it to her without her having to fight for it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said it quietly. "You came looking for answers, Emily. Some of them are going to be hard. I know. You keep saying that because I mean it. Jack looked at her, at this girl who had driven 400 miles in a storm, who had touched a dead man's patch with hands that didn't shake, who had cried and hadn't been ashamed of crying, who asked honest questions and sat still for honest answers, and carried a little cardboard box with her father's last instructions folded at the bottom like a compass. Yeah, he said. I think maybe you do. She got in her car. He watched her taillights until they turned onto the highway and disappeared. Then he stood there in the parking lot, alone in the wet night, with a door open inside him that he hadn't planned on opening. He thought about Daniel Carter. He thought about 1996 and everything that came after and all the silence in between. He thought about a note at the bottom of a cardboard box that said, "Tell him I never stopped." He reached up and touched his vest, the patch. The same one he'd worn for 30 years, through everything. Worn it even when he stopped riding. Worn it even when he had no chapter and no brother and no road to follow, because some things you don't take off. Some things are the last piece of something that mattered, and you keep them close because taking them off would mean accepting that everything they stood for was finished. He hadn't accepted that. He still hadn't. He walked back to his own truck in the empty parking lot, and he sat behind the wheel for a long time without starting the engine. And he thought, Danny, you absolute son of a gun. You couldn't just let it lie, could you? He thought about a 20-year-old girl driving alone in the dark toward a cheap motel, carrying her father's last words and 3 years of searching and eyes that looked like an open door. He thought about the promise he'd made. Not the one he'd spoken out loud, not any specific thing said on any specific night, but the other kind. The kind that lives between people who have been through enough together that some things don't need saying. The kind that doesn't expire. He will know what to do. He always did. Jack started the engine. He didn't know what to do. Not yet. Not entirely. But he knew where to start. He pulled out his phone and found a number he hadn't called in 8 months. And when the voice on the other end picked up with the particular gruffness of a man who didn't answer numbers he didn't recognize, Jack said, "It's Walker. I need you to listen to something." And then he told his oldest living road brother that Daniel Carter's daughter had found them. The silence on the other end lasted a long time. "God almighty," Reeves said finally. "How old is she?" 20. "She all right?" "She's better than all right." Jack paused. "She's his." Reeves, right down to the bone. Another silence. "What are you going to do?" Jack looked out through the windshield at the highway, at the wet road catching the light, at the direction Emily's taillights had gone. "What Danny asked me to," he said. 20 years late, he put the truck in gear. Jack Walker didn't sleep that night. He sat in the parking lot of the Sunrise Motel, not his motel. Hers for 40 minutes with the engine off, not watching, not hovering, just making sure her light came on in room 7 and stayed on. It was an old habit, the kind you develop when you've lost someone you were supposed to be watching out for, and you can't afford to let it happen again. When the light came on, he drove away. He was at his own place by midnight, a rented room above a machine shop on the south side of town that suited him because it was cheap, and the landlord didn't ask questions, and the noise of the machinery during the day gave him something to anchor himself to. He sat at the edge of his bed and stared at nothing and thought about a girl with her father's eyes and a cardboard box full of unanswered questions. And he thought about Danny Carter, and he thought about 1996, and he didn't sleep. At 6:15 in the morning, his phone rang. He picked up on the second ring. "Yeah, she's still there." It was Reeves. Marcus Reeves, 58 years old, road name Freight, 6'3", and built like a man who had spent 30 years proving he didn't need to raise his voice to make a point. He had been Daniel Carter's road brother too. Back in the Phoenix years, he had also spent 20 years not talking about it. "She's at the motel," Jack said. "Sunrise, off the main road." "You stayed?" "I parked." "There's a difference." A pause. "Sure there is." Reeves let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. "What are you going to do?" "I'm going to talk to her." "And tell her what?" "Whatever she can handle, Jack." Reeves's voice dropped to the register he used when he was serious, which was most of the time. But this was a different kind of serious. There are things she can't hear from you. Things she needs to hear from the people who were actually there. I know. That means Denton. That means Ortega. That means people who haven't exactly been waiting by the phone to revisit this particular chapter. I know, Jack said again. You're going to call them. It wasn't really a question. I'm going to do what Danny asked, Jack said. All of it, however long it takes. Another pause, longer this time. I'm 3 hours out, Reeves said finally. I can be there by 10. Jack closed his eyes for a moment. 20 years of mostly riding alone, and Marcus Reeves was offering to be there in 3 hours. Some things survive time. The right ones. I'll tell her to expect you. Don't tell her anything. I want to see her face when she sees me. I want to see if she looks like him. She does. Yeah, well. Reeves' voice went rough around the edges. I'll see for myself. Emily was already awake when Jack knocked on her motel room door at 8 o'clock. She answered it with wet hair and a cup of vending machine coffee and the expression of someone who had also not slept much but wasn't about to complain about it. You're early, she said. I'm on time. You're just not late. She stepped back and let him in. The room was clean and small, and she had clearly been going through the cardboard box. Again, it was open on the bed. Its contents laid out in careful order, photographs and letters unfolded, scraps of paper arranged to blushing in lines that suggested she'd been sorting them, trying to build a timeline. Jack stood in the doorway of the room and looked at that arrangement and felt something tighten in his chest. Because he recognized some of those photographs. He recognized them, the way you recognize things from your own memory, not from seeing the print, but from having been there. He gestured at the bed. Please, she said. He crossed the room and picked up the photograph closest to him. It was taken outside. 4 men around a set of bikes, squinting into the sun, all of them looking young in the way that only becomes visible in retrospect. Jack was on the far left. Daniel Carter was second from the right, grinning, his arm thrown around the shoulders of a man with a dark beard who Jack had not thought about in at least 2 years. Ortega, Jack said quietly. Is that his name? Emily moved to stand beside him, close but not crowding. He's in 4 of the photographs. I couldn't find a first name. Ramon. Everyone called him Ray. Jack set the photograph down carefully. He was with us from the beginning. One of the best riders I ever knew. Is he still alive? As far as I know. Jack paused. He's not going to be easy to get to. He cut contact with most of the old chapter about 15 years ago. He had his reasons. Emily studied the photograph. Connected to my father. Connected to a lot of things. He moved to the next photograph. This one he almost put down without looking at it properly. Almost. A younger version of himself at a diner table, and across from him, Daniel not laughing this time. Not performing for a camera. Just sitting. Tired and serious and present, the way Daniel had been when something was weighing on him and he didn't have a performance left in him. When was this? Emily asked softly. 1995. Jack set it down. About 8 months before everything fell apart. She let the words land. She didn't rush past them. Tell me about that. About how it fell apart. He sat down in the chair by the window. Not on the bed was her territory, her investigation, her father's things. He took the chair. Your father made a decision in the spring of 1996. A unilateral decision. He didn't consult anyone, didn't give anyone warning, didn't ask for opinions. He just made the call and acted on it. What was the decision? He walked into a police station in Phoenix and sat down and gave a voluntary statement about a man named Gerald Price. Emily was very still. Who was Gerald Price? A businessman, connected to certain supply chains that certain members of our chapter had allowed themselves to get involved with. Jack kept his voice flat and clinical because it was the only way he could say it. Things that should never have been part of what we were. Things that Danny argued against from the beginning, loudly in front of everyone. He was right to argue against them. He was also outnumbered. So he went to the police. He went to the police, Jack confirmed, and he gave them everything he knew about Price. Not about the chapter. He was very specific and very careful about that. He gave them Price's operation, Price's connections, Price's people. He protected his brothers. But Price had protectors too, people in the chapter who had financial ties to his operation. And when word got out that Daniel had talked, Jack stopped. He was out, Emily said. He was gone. Overnight. Chapter voted, and the people with the most to lose drove the decision. He was stripped. His patch, Jack's hand moved unconsciously toward his own chest. He was out. I didn't vote with them. Neither did Reeves. Neither did Ortega. But we were 3 against 8, and the 8 won. Emily sat down on the edge of the bed among her father's photographs. She was quiet for a moment. He went to the police to do the right thing, she said. Yes. And he lost everything. Yes. She picked up the photograph of Daniel smiling, the early one, the happy one. She looked at it for a long moment. He never told me any of this. He never told me he'd had a life like this. He used to come pick me up from school in his truck, and we'd stop for ice cream, and he'd ask about my homework. Her voice was steady, but just barely. He was the most ordinary man. That's what I grew up thinking. Just this quiet, ordinary man. He wanted that for you, Jack said. The ordinary. I know that now. She set the photograph down. What I don't understand is why, if he was out, if he'd lost his patch and his chapter and everything, why did he still have a photograph of you? Why did he keep writing about you? Why did he leave me your name? Jack leaned forward in the chair, his elbows on his knees. Because I went to see him, he said. 2 weeks after the vote. I drove to the apartment he was renting in Tempe, and I knocked on his door, and when he opened it, I told him I thought the vote was wrong, and I thought he'd done the right thing, and I thought it wasn't going to be the end of everything. He stopped. Emily waited, but it was, he said. Not immediately. We talked. We met up a few more times over the next few months. But the people who'd voted him out, they didn't like that I was still talking to him. And there were pressures. Things I'm not going to get into right now. And eventually, he pressed his hands together. Eventually, there was a night where I made a choice that I've been ashamed of ever since. I chose the easier path. And after that night, Danny and I didn't speak again. The room was absolutely quiet. What did you do? Emily asked. I didn't show up, Jack said simply. He needed me there for something. And I got a message warning me off, and I chose to listen to the warning. I told myself I'd fix it later. I told myself he'd understand, that I'd explain, that there would be time. He looked at his hands. There wasn't time. He moved out of Arizona that month. And by the time I looked up from my own life long enough to try to find him, he'd built walls specifically designed to make sure nobody from that period could reach him. He was protecting us, Emily said. Me and my mother. If those people were looking for him, yes, Jack looked at her. That's what I've come to believe. That the walls weren't about anger. They were about keeping you safe. That's Danny's logic from beginning to end. Keep the people you love on the safe side of whatever's dangerous. Even if it costs you. He paused. Even if it costs you everything. Emily's eyes were bright. She wasn't crying yet, but it was close. He was alone, she said. All those years. He was alone because of a choice he made to protect us. He had you, Jack said quietly. He had ice cream and homework and a truck and ordinary Tuesdays. From what you're describing, I think he chose that. I think he chose it deliberately, and I think on some level it made him happy. But he never stopped. No, Jack's voice was firm. He didn't. At 10 minutes past 10, there was a knock at the door. Emily looked at Jack. Jack stood up, and something about the way he moved deliberate, almost ceremonial, told her this was expected. She opened the door. The man standing in the hallway was enormous, wide across the shoulders, with close-cropped gray hair and a face that looked like it had made peace with itself somewhere around age 40 and stopped worrying after that. He wore a leather vest. He had the same kind of patch Jack had. He looked at Emily for a long moment without speaking. Then something shifted in his expression, not a smile. Exactly. Something deeper than a smile, and he said, in a voice like gravel and old wood, God Almighty, you look just like him. Emily's breath caught. Marcus Reeves, Jack said from behind her. He and your father rode together for 6 years. Emily stepped back. Reeves came inside, and he stood in the middle of the room looking at the photographs on the bed with the expression of a man who has just walked into his own past. He picked up the group photograph, the one with all four of them. He looked at it for a long time. 1993, he said. Albuquerque Run. It was so hot that week, Ortega swore his boots were melting to the asphalt. He set it down very carefully. Danny talked about you, Emily said. In his letters, Reeves turned to look at her. What did he say? He said you were the funniest person he'd ever met, and you absolutely refused to admit it. Reeves made a sound low, rough, somewhere between a laugh and something else. That sounds right. He sat down heavily in the second chair. I'm sorry I didn't know he passed. I'm sorry nobody knew. He was careful about that, Emily said. About keeping things separate. Yeah, he always was. Reeves looked at Jack. You tell her about 96? The short version. You leave out the part where you drove to Tempe in the middle of the night after the vote and told him you'd figure it out? Reeves looked at Jack with an expression that was almost challenging. The part where you promised. Jack's jaw tightened. I was getting there. Emily looked between them. You promised him what? A silence fell between the two men, the particular silence of people who have had this argument before, or the version of it that lives in the unspoken space between old guilt and old loyalty. He promised Danny that he wouldn't let the chapter decision be the end, Reeves said, that he'd find a way to make it right, that he'd make sure Danny wasn't left hanging out there alone. He said it without cruelty, but without softening it either. And then things got complicated, and Jack made a bad call on a bad night, and the promise didn't get kept. Emily turned to Jack. Jack was looking at the floor. That's what he meant, she said slowly. In the note, tell him I never stopped. He never stopped believing you'd find a way to make it right. Her voice was very quiet. Even 20 years later, he still believed that. The room was very still. Jack looked up. His expression was the kind that forms when something that has been pressing against a wall for a very long time finally pushes all the way through. That's worse, he said, his voice barely above a nothing. That's considerably worse than him being angry. I know, Emily said. And she said it with so much gentleness that Reeves looked at her with something that was unmistakably respect. They stayed in that room for 3 hours. Reeves talked. Once he started, he was like a channel that had been blocked for years, suddenly running clear. He told her about Daniel in the early days, genuinely funny stories, detailed and warm, the kind that could only come from someone who'd been there. He told her about the cross-country run in '91, about the time Daniel had convinced the entire chapter to detour 300 miles so he could see the Grand Canyon because he'd never been, and figured he should fix that. About the way Daniel used to sing badly loudly, entirely without self-consciousness whenever they hit a long straight stretch of empty highway. Emily laughed. Real laughter surprised out of her, the kind that lands before you can decide whether it's appropriate. And every time she laughed, Reeves and Jack both went quiet for a half second, hearing something in the sound of it. But Reeves also told her harder things. He talked about the chapter's deterioration. In the mid-90s, how the original purpose had blurred and compromised elements had crept in, and how Daniel had fought it vocally and persistently and at personal cost for 2 years before he finally took the action that got him expelled. He talked about the men who had driven that vote, 2 of whom were dead now, 1 of whom was in federal prison, 1 of whom Reeves had not spoken to in 18 years and intended to keep it that way. He was right, Reeves said flatly. Danny was right about all of it. Price went to prison eventually anyway. The FBI had been building a case for years, and Danny's statement accelerated the timeline, but they would have gotten there. The men in our chapter who were connected to Price's operation lost everything. 2 of them did time, and Danny, he shook his head. Danny lost everything first, before any of it caught up to anyone else. He paid the price first and then watched everyone else pay it later, and he never once said, I told you so. I know that because I kept tabs on him off and on for years, never reached out, just kept tabs. Why didn't you reach out? Emily asked. Reeves was quiet for a moment. Shame, he said simply. I didn't stop the vote. I voted against it, but I didn't stop it. I didn't do enough. And there's a version of keeping tabs on someone that's just watching from a safe distance, so you can tell yourself you haven't completely abandoned them. He looked at Emily. I know how that sounds. It sounds human, she said. He studied her. You're not what I expected. What did you expect? An angry kid looking for someone to blame. I was angry, she said, for a long time. But I drove 400 miles last night and I sat in that diner. And this man, she gestured at Jack. He answered every question I asked him. He didn't flinch. He didn't make excuses. And I realized that blame it's just a wall. It keeps you in one place. She paused. I don't want to stay in one place. I want to understand what actually happened. All of it. Reeves turned to Jack. The look he gave him said something that didn't require words. She's his. All the way down. Jack received the look and said nothing. It was Reeves who brought up the box first. They had been talking for nearly 2 hours when he leaned forward and looked at the contents spread across the bed and said, there are things in there that aren't just letters. There are things Danny left for a reason. Emily looked at the box. The photographs I understand. The letters I understand. But there are 3 other things. She moved carefully among the contents and lifted them one at a time. A small brass key. A folded piece of paper that wasn't a letter but appeared to be a list names, dates, numbers, and a photograph unlike the others. Not the chapter, not the rides, not the memories. Just a man standing outside a building with a sign Emily couldn't fully read. She held up the photograph. Do you know who this is? Reeves leaned in. His expression changed immediately. He took the photograph from her and held it at arm's length, and then brought it close and looked at it with the focused intensity of someone who has just been handed information they weren't expecting. Where did Danny get this? He said. I don't know. It was under everything else in the box. Reeves handed the photograph to Jack. Jack looked at it. His expression matched Reeves' exactly recognition, followed immediately by a sharp attentiveness, the kind that precedes action. That's Gerald Price, Jack said. Emily's breath came in quickly. The man my father reported to the police. Yes, Jack turned the photograph over. On the back, in Daniel's handwriting, was a date. Not from 1996. Not from the early years. From 14 months ago. The room went very quiet. That photograph was taken recently, Reeves said. Slowly. Like he was working through something as he spoke. Danny took a photograph of Gerald Price 14 months ago and put it in a box with a key and a list of names. What does that mean? Emily said. Neither man answered immediately. Then Jack said, it means your father wasn't just protecting old information. It means he found out something new. He set the photograph down. It means Gerald Price, who was supposed to have served his time and disappeared, was still relevant to something 14 months ago. He looked at Emily. And your father knew about it. Emily looked at the list. The names and numbers that she hadn't been able to decode. Is that what this is? Names connected to Price. I need to look at it more carefully. Jack reached toward the list, then stopped. He looked at her. I'm going to tell you something now, and I need you to hear all of it before you react. Emily's chin came up. Okay. Your father may have been keeping an eye on Price for years. Not for the police. Not for anyone official. For himself. Watching, gathering, making sure. Jack paused. And if he put this in a box and addressed it to you and told you to find me, it means he believed that at some point you'd need to know what he knew. And it means he thought I'd know how to handle it. Handle what? Specifically. Jack met her eyes. Whatever Price is still connected to. And whoever it's going to protect or hurt. The silence that followed was not the soft kind. It was the kind with weight to it. Emily looked at the key in her hand. Small brass with a number etched into the bow. A safety deposit box, most likely. A storage unit. Something with a lock that hadn't been opened yet. Her father had been working on something in the last months of his life. Something he hadn't told her about. Something he had prepared for her to find, but only if she found Jack Walker first. Only if she did this in order. He planned this, she said. Not accusatory, just understanding arriving. He planned for me to find you. He knew I might need to know all of this someday. He prepared for it. Danny always planned 3 moves ahead. Reeves said quietly. It used to drive everyone crazy. He'd be quiet about it, not talking, just thinking, and then he'd do something and suddenly 5 things made sense that hadn't made sense before. He paused. Looks like he played one more hand. Emily closed her fingers around the key. Where do I start? She said. Jack and Reeves looked at each other. 20 years of history in a single glance. Two men who had been on the same road and then on different roads and who had ended up somehow in the same room with Daniel Carter's daughter, asking them where to begin. You start, Jack said, by understanding that you're not doing this alone. Reeves nodded. One firm motion, decided. Emily looked at them both. These two men, with their gray, in their beards and their worn patches, and their 20 years of guilt and their love for her father clear. Undeniable, the kind that doesn't die just because time passes, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time. Something she hadn't fully realized she'd been missing. She felt like she was in a room with people who were on her side. Not because they had to be. Not because of obligation. Because Daniel Carter had trusted them with his most important thing, his daughter, and they were not going to fail him twice. Okay, she said. Her voice was steady. Completely steady. Then tell me everything. From the beginning. Everything you know. Jack looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, this is going to take a while. I'm not going anywhere, Emily said, and she meant it. Jack started talking at noon and didn't stop until nearly 3 o'clock. He talked the way men like him talked when they finally decided to talk, not with polish, not with narrative structure, but in the order that things surfaced, following the current of memory wherever it ran, doubling back sometimes, cutting forward others. And Emily sat on the edge of the bed, with her father's photographs around her, and listened with the complete and total attention that Dale Carter had also been capable of, and that was, in its own way, the most unsettling thing about her. Reeves filled in the gaps. Between the two of them, they assembled the years, the Phoenix chapter in its good period, the slow contamination of Price's money, Daniel's resistance, the vote, the expulsion, the silence after. Emily had heard the outline of this in part 2. Now she got the texture of it, the specific nights, the specific arguments, the exact words Daniel had used when he stood up in front of the full chapter and said what he thought about the direction they were heading, clearly, without hedging, the way he did everything. He said, and I'm quoting as close as I can remember, Reeves said, he said, I didn't ride 1,000 miles to become a courier service for a man in a suit who doesn't know what this road costs. And then he sat down, and nobody said anything for about 30 seconds. Reeves paused, and then the men with the financial ties to Price started talking, and Danny let them talk. And that was the beginning of the end. Emily absorbed this. He wasn't afraid of them. No, Jack said. That was always his problem and his finest quality simultaneously. She picked up the list from the bed, the names and numbers. She had been looking at it periodically throughout the morning, and something had been nagging at her about the formatting, the way the numbers were arranged. Not in a column, but in groups. 3 digits, then a dash, then 4, then a dash, then 6. Not phone numbers. Something else. What are these numbers? She asked. Jack took the list, looked at it, turned it over. Account numbers, Reeves said immediately. He leaned in. The format, that's offshore account formatting. Caribbean, probably. Some of those registries use that exact structure. He looked at Jack. Danny found his money. Jack looked up from the list. He found Price's money. The temperature in the room seemed to drop by several degrees. Price went to prison, Emily said carefully. That's what you told me. He served time. 4 years, Jack said. Out in 2002 on good behavior. And a man like Price, with a man like Price connections and resources, 4 years is an interruption, not an ending. He set the list down. The federal case hit his visible assets. Accounts they could trace, property they could seize. But men like Price build redundancy into their finances the way other people build it into their infrastructure. There was always going to be money they couldn't find. But my father found it, Emily said. Your father, Reeves said slowly, was an accountant before he rode. Did you know that? Emily stared at him. What? 2 years of accounting school. He left before he finished his degree, but he retained everything. Numbers were his second language. Reeves sat back. He never talked about it much. It wasn't exactly the image, but it was useful, more than once in the years I knew him. He looked at the list. This is Danny doing what Danny did when he was angry and patient at the same time. He tracked Price's money, thread by thread, for years, probably. Emily felt something shift inside her, a rearrangement of the picture she had been building since the night before. Her father, the quiet man who worked at the hardware store. Her father, who asked about her homework and made ordinary Tuesdays feel safe. And her father, who had spent years quietly, invisibly, methodically building a case against a man he had never stopped watching. Why, she said, he was out. He was safe. We were safe. Why keep pulling on that thread? Jack and Reeves looked at each other, and this time the glance between them was different. Longer, heavier. The kind that carries information that hasn't been spoken yet. Tell me, Emily said. Jack put his hands flat on the table. What do you know about your mother leaving? Emily went still. She left when I was 7. My father said it was complicated, that they wanted different things. He never said anything bad about her ever, but he also never explained it in any detail that made real sense. She paused. Why? Because, Jack said carefully, what we know, and this is second and third hand, Emily, so I want you to hold it with appropriate uncertainty. What we know is that your mother didn't leave on her own terms. The silence that followed was absolute. What does that mean? Her voice was very controlled. It means that Price, after he got out of prison, went looking for leverage. For anyone connected to the people who had helped bring him down. Your father's testimony had been part of the case, not the central part, but a part, and Price had a long memory and resources and no particular reason to forgive. Jack kept his eyes on hers. We believe your mother was approached, threatened. Given a choice between distance from your father and consequences, she wasn't willing to risk falling on you. Emily's hand went flat on the bedspread. A steadying gesture. Unconscious. She left to protect me, Emily said. The words came out very quietly. That's what we believe happened. Yes. My father knew. Yes, and he let me think she just left. That they just. Her jaw was tight. He let me grow up thinking she chose to go. He was protecting you, Jack said. The same logic, always the same logic. Keep you on the safe side of the dangerous thing. If you'd known about Price, if you'd known about the threat, if you'd been angry enough or scared enough to go looking. He thought I'd go looking, Emily said flatly. You drove 400 miles in a storm based on letters you found in a dead man's jacket. Reeves said, not unkindly. What do you think? Emily looked at him. A muscle worked in her jaw. And then slowly, reluctantly, she exhaled. He knew me, she said. He knew exactly what He knew you, Jack agreed. She stood up. She needed to move. She walked to the window and stood there with her back to them, and neither man said anything, because they both understood that what was happening inside her right now needed space and not commentary. Her mother hadn't left. Not really. Not the way Emily had understood it at 7, at 12, at 17, at every age. She had assembled her story of who she was and why the people who were supposed to stay had gone. The entire architecture of her loss had just shifted. One piece moved and everything above it rearranged. She turned around. Where is my mother now? She said. Jack shook his head. I don't know. Honestly, I can try to find out. She could be anywhere. She could be. But she left a trail at some point. Most people do. If she's alive. If Emily. His voice was very gentle. I don't know. I'm not going to tell you what I don't know. She received that. Nodded once. Okay. She came back to the bed and sat down. What else don't I know? What she didn't know filled the next 40 minutes. The key, the small brass key with the number etched into it, was for a safety deposit box at a bank in Flagstaff, Arizona. Jack recognized the key type because he had held one identical to it for 11 years before using it. The number etched in was a box number. That meant Daniel had set up the box, paid the annual fee, and kept it active, probably for years. And in Flagstaff, specifically not where Daniel had lived, not where he'd worked, not where Emily had grown up with him, but Flagstaff. which was where the old chapter had been based, which was where the night that Jack had described had taken place in 1994. The night Daniel had written about in 6 pages, front and back. He went back to Flagstaff, Reeves said. More than once, based on the date on the Price photograph, Jack said. He was building something, Emily said. Evidence. A record. Something that could be used. Against Price. Against whatever Price was still running. Against whoever was still protecting him. She picked up the photograph again. Gerald Price, 14 months ago, standing outside a building. She looked at the building. She had been trying to read the sign since she found the photograph. Now, with the sun at a slightly different angle through the motel window, she could make out 2 words on the sign. She turned the photograph toward Jack. Can you read that? Jack looked. His eyes sharpened. Meridian Capital, he said. Reeves was already on his phone. He typed. Read. His face changed. Meridian Capital Group, he said. Incorporated in Nevada, 2019. Financial Services Company. Current CEO listed as. Who? Emily said. Reeves looked up. A man named Robert Halloran, who was, according to a 2021 federal filing I'm looking at right now, formerly a senior financial officer for Price, Consolidated, between 1998 and 2002. Right up until Price went to prison, Jack said. And then he disappeared into the woodwork for 17 years, Reeves continued, and then reappeared as the CEO of a company that your father photographed, Gerald Price, walking out of 14 months ago. The 3 of them sat with that for a moment. Price never stopped, Emily said. He just changed the name on the door. He cleaned up, Jack said. New company, new face on the front, legitimate-looking structure. The account numbers on that list, if Danny tracked those correctly, those accounts are probably the pipeline between Price's money and Meridian's operations. My father had proof, Emily said, or close to it. He had the account numbers, the photograph, probably more in the box in Flagstaff. He was building a case. And then he died before he could. She stopped. A silence. He died before he could what? Reeves said carefully. Before he could use it? Or before he could make sure someone else had it? Emily looked at the box. At the careful arrangement, her father had made the photographs, the letters, the key, the list. The note at the bottom with Jack's name on it. He finished the case, she said slowly, the understanding arriving cold and certain. He finished it. It's in Flagstaff. The box in Flagstaff has everything. And he put the key in here because he knew that when he was gone, I'd come looking. And he knew I'd find Jack. She looked up. He knew Jack would know what to do with evidence against a man like Price. Danny, Reeves said quietly. Not to Jack, not to Emily. Just the name, alone into the air. Like a salute. Jack stood up. He had a look on his face that Emily had not seen from him yet, focused. Forward pointed, the expression of a man who has just found out what the next thing to do is and is already, mentally, 3 steps into doing it. We need to go to Flagstaff, he said. When? Emily said. Tomorrow morning. Early. Why not today? Because I need to make some calls first. There are people who need to know what we're looking at before we open that box. He looked at Reeves. Ortega. I'll reach out, Reeves said. And we need to talk to someone who understands financial crimes. Not law enforcement, not yet. Someone we trust first. Jack turned back to Emily. Do you understand what your father built here? What he was trying to accomplish? He wanted Price finished, Emily said. Really finished. Not 4 years and then back to business. Actually finished. He wanted the whole structure dismantled, Jack said. The money, the new operation, the protection. All of it. And he worked alone because the only people he trusted with something this size were people he hadn't spoken to in 20 years. You, Emily said. Me, Reeves. Ortega. Jack's voice had something in it that was simultaneously grief and purpose. He trusted us to be the people we were in 1996. Before the bad vote. Before the compromises. He paused. He trusted us to be the better version. Emily looked at this man, this large, quiet, weathered man who had spent 20 years carrying a guilt he didn't need to carry, who had opened a door he'd thought was locked for good, who was now standing in a motel room making decisions with the energy of someone who had been waiting for a reason and had just been handed one. "You're going to do it," she said. "You're going to finish what he started." "We're going to finish what he started," Jack said. "All of us." Emily shook her head. "Not. You're his daughter," Jack said firmly. "That box is in your name. The key is yours. You're the one person in this situation that Price's lawyers can't touch legally or strategically. You're also," he stopped, reconsidered, started again more carefully. "Emily, your father didn't just leave you a mystery to solve. He left you a position, a role. He thought this through." She looked at the key in her hand. "He always planned 3 moves ahead." "Right down to the end," Reeves said. She closed her fingers around the key again. The metal was warm now from being held. Her father's hands had held this key, had chosen it, purchased it, thought about what it opened and what that opening would eventually mean. She thought about him sitting across from her at the kitchen table on ordinary nights, asking about her homework, pouring cereal, watching TV with his feet up and his face completely at rest. This quiet, ordinary man who carried nothing visible on the surface. And underneath all that ordinary, he had been doing this, quietly, patiently, alone, for years. She had been angry at the ordinary. She had wanted, as a teenager, some version of her father that was more present, more expressive, more willing to explain himself. And the whole time, the ordinary had been the armor. The quiet had been the protection. He had made himself look like nothing to keep her safe from the people who would have noticed if he looked like something. The grief hit her differently now. Not the grief of losing a quiet, ordinary man. The grief of losing someone who had been, secretly, extraordinary, and who had hidden it entirely out of love. She put her face in her hands, not crying or not only crying. Something more complex than that. The feeling of an entire understanding of a person cracking open and reforming into something larger and truer. Reeves, with the instinct of a man who had sat with difficult things before, put his hand briefly on her shoulder and then removed it. He didn't speak. Jack brought her a glass of water from the bathroom without being asked. She drank it. She straightened. She looked at them both. "He was incredible," she said. Her voice was rough but steady. "I knew he was good. I didn't know he was incredible." "He was the best man I ever rode with," Jack said simply. "And I rode with a lot of men. He was the most honest person in any room he was ever in," Reeves said. "You can't say that about many people. He was the kind of honest that costs you things." "It cost him everything," Emily said. "And he paid it," Jack said. And then he kept going, quietly in his own way. "That's not tragedy, Emily. That's character." She looked at him, and something in the way he said, it made her realize that he had needed to say it, that it was as much for him as for her. That Jack Walker was working something out in real time, in this motel room, on this ordinary Tuesday morning that had turned into the most consequential morning of his last decade. "Okay," she said. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand and reached for the photograph of Price and the list of account numbers. "Tell me what I need to know before Flagstaff. Tell me everything about Price, how he operated, what his pressure points were, what he's afraid of." She looked up. "If I'm going to walk into that bank and open that box and carry whatever my father left there to wherever it needs to go, I want to understand exactly what I'm carrying." Jack sat back down. "All right, all of it," she said. "Don't protect me from it." He held her gaze for a moment. "Danny raised you right," he said quietly. "He did," she agreed. "Now tell me how to finish what he started." They ordered food from the diner down the road, Reeves went, because he was the kind of man who was good at appearing unremarkable when he needed to, and while he was gone, Jack called Ortega. The phone rang 6 times, and Jack had almost decided to hang up when the line connected, and a voice said, "I don't recognize this number." "It's Walker." A silence. "Jackson Walker." "Yeah, it's been a while." Ramon Ortega's voice was careful. He was a careful man, had been careful for 15 years, ever since he'd built a new life in Tucson that had no visible connection to anything that had come before it. He ran a small auto shop. He had a wife and 2 daughters and a dog and a lawn he mowed on Saturdays. He had been one of the 3 who had voted against the expulsion and one of the two who had lost their patch for voting the wrong way. And he had been quietly, privately, devastatingly angry about it for years before he put it away and moved forward. I know, Jack said. Listen, Daniel Carter's daughter found me. Silence. Different this time. She came looking, Ortega said finally. Drove 400 miles. She's here. She's got a key to a safety deposit box in Flagstaff and a photograph of Price from 14 months ago and a list of account numbers. The silence on the other end was the sharpest yet. Say that last part again. Jack said it again. God, Ortega said. He said it like he'd been punched. Danny, you crazy, brilliant, stubborn man. I need you in Flagstaff, Jack said. Day after tomorrow. Jack, I know what I'm asking. I have a life here. I know. I have people who depend on me. I know that too. And I'm still asking. He trusted us. Ray, all three of us. And we let him down once. I don't want to do it twice. The longest silence yet. 20 seconds. 30. Day after tomorrow, Ortega said finally. What time? 10 in the morning. I'll text you the address. Is she what she like? The daughter. Jack thought about it. She's 20 years old, and she drove 400 miles alone in a storm, and she sat in a diner with a stranger and asked every hard question without flinching. He paused. She has his eyes. She has his laugh. She thinks faster than she lets on, and she won't be protected from things she's decided to know. So, she's Danny, Ortega said. She's Danny in 20-year-old form. Yes, God help us all, Ortega said. And then, despite everything, he laughed a short, genuine sound, surprised out of him, and Jack heard in it the exact same laughter from 30 years ago when the three of them and Daniel had been young and on the road and alive in a way that life had subsequently complicated. I'll be there. Jack hung up as Reeves came back through the door with bags of food and the settled expression a man had been thinking while he walked. Ortega, Reeves said. He's in. Reeves set the food down. Emily was still on the bed, the list in her lap, studying it with the focused attention she gave everything. She looked up. 3 of you, she said, plus me. 4, Jack said. 4, she repeated. And we open the box day after tomorrow. Tomorrow I make calls. Reeves works his contacts on the financial side. There's a man in Denver who understands offshore structures and has done federal consulting work. We get him on the phone. We walk him through the account numbers. We understand what we're actually looking at before we touch it formally. Emily nodded. She was processing. And when we open the box, whatever's in there, we handle it correctly. We don't go charging at price. We don't go public half-cocked. Danny built something careful, and we dismantle it carefully. Jack looked at her steadily. Your father spent years doing this right. We honor that, she held his gaze. And whoever Price pressured to get at my mother. Jack nodded. That too, all of it. He hurt my family, Emily said. The quietness of her voice was not softness. It was something much more controlled than softness. He made my mother disappear from my life. He made my father spend 20 years fighting a silent war alone. She stopped, collected herself, started again. He took things from people he had no right to take. And he is apparently still doing it under a different name, with different furniture. Yes, Jack said. He is. Then we end it, she said. Simple, certain. The way Daniel Carter had always said things when he'd made up his mind. Jack felt it again, that sensation of a door opening, of air moving through something that had been sealed, but different now. Less like grief and more like direction. Like the feeling of a road in front of you on a clear day when you know where you're going and you're not afraid of the distance. We end it, he said. Reeves unwrapped his food and ate without ceremony and said, between bites, in the meantime, can someone explain to me what happened to that chili recipe? Because Danny swore he wrote it down somewhere, and I have been making inferior chili for 23 years as a direct result of its loss. Emily stared at him for exactly 1 second. Then she started laughing, and Jack laughed too. And the sound of it filled that small, ordinary motel room in a way that had nothing ordinary about it. 3 people in a room with 1 ghost between them, laughing because the ghost would have wanted them to. Because laughter was how you honored someone who had loved life enough to protect everyone in it. Emily reached into the box. She pulled out a folded index card from the bottom one, she had looked at but not understood when she'd first sorted through the contents. She unfolded it, looked at it, and then she held it up. It was a recipe. Handwritten, her father's handwriting. At the top, underlined twice, real chili. Do not share with Reeves until he apologizes for New Mexico, 1993. Reeves made a sound that was either a laugh or something more complicated and reached for the card with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. He held it for a long time before he said anything. I don't even remember what I did in New Mexico in 1993, he said finally. Whatever it was, Jack said he remembered. Emily watched Reeves hold her father's handwriting like it was something sacred. She watched Jack watch Reeves, and she thought, this is what the patch means. Not the motorcycle, not the road. This. The ability to carry a person with you through decades and across distance, and through all the ways that life breaks the things you built. The refusal to let someone become entirely past tense just because they're gone. Her father had known. He'd known she would find this room, this box, these men. He'd known the chili card would be the thing that broke through whatever wall was left. He'd planned it, 3 moves ahead, all the way to the end. She picked up the photograph of her father, from 1993 young, grinning, arm around Ortega's shoulders. She looked at him. I see you, she thought. I see all of it now. And for the first time since she'd found the box in his jacket lining, since she'd started the search, since she'd driven 400 miles in a storm toward a name in an old letter, she felt her father close. Not gone, not lost. Present in this room, in these men, in the key in her hand and the case he had built and the careful love that had designed every piece of it. Present, she was not done finding him, not even close. They left for Flagstaff at 6:30 in the morning. Jack drove. Emily rode with him in the truck because her car had a slow leak in the rear left tire that she had been ignoring for 200 miles and that Jack had noticed the moment he walked past it in the motel parking lot and crouched down and looked at it with the expression of a man who found negligence toward machinery personally offensive. He didn't lecture her about it. He just said, "You're riding with me," in a tone that made the decision final, and called Reeves to follow in his own vehicle, so they'd have a second car in Flagstaff if they needed to split up. Ortega was already there when they arrived. He was waiting in the bank parking lot in a gray pickup, leaning against the driver's side door with his arms crossed and his road name earned all over again in the width of his shoulders and the set of his jaw. He was 61 now, with silver threading through his dark hair and a face that had done a lot of living in the years since Phoenix. He wore no patch. He hadn't worn one in 15 years. He pushed off from the truck when he saw Jack's vehicle pull in. And he and Jack did the thing that old road brothers do, not a handshake. Something more compressed than that. A brief, hard grip at the shoulder that communicated everything the last 20 years had cost them without requiring a single word. Then Reeves and Ortega stood looking at each other with the particular expression of two men who have missed each other more than they were prepared to admit. And then Ortega turned to Emily. He looked at her the way Reeves had looked at her in the motel doorway, that searching quality, that inventory of features and expression and posture. But Ortega took longer. He had known Daniel Carter the longest of the three. He had ridden with him first, before Jack, before Reeves, in the earliest days before the Phoenix chapter had fully formed. He had more to compare against. "Hi," Emily said, because she was 20 and this was overwhelming, and sometimes the only available word is the simplest one. Ortega put both hands on her shoulders, gently, and looked at her face for a long moment. "He talked about you," he said. "Not to everyone, but to me, sometimes in the early years before everything went wrong. He'd had a daughter. He said her name like it was the most careful thing he owned." He paused. Emily. Her name in his mouth, said the way her father had apparently said it, like something precious, and weight-bearing, undid her in a way that 6 hours of revelation the day before had not entirely managed. She hugged him. She didn't plan to. It just happened, the way things happen. When you have been alone with the grief for 3 years and you suddenly find yourself surrounded by people who are carrying the same weight. And finally, you are not the only one holding it. Ortega hugged her back without hesitation. He was solid and warm, and she could feel him exhale slowly, like something releasing. Okay, he said when she stepped back and collected herself. Let's go see what Danny left us. The safety deposit box was registered in Daniel Carter's name. With Emily listed as secondary holder, he had added her name 3 years before his death, which meant he had planned the timing of all of this with the same methodical patience he had applied to everything else. The bank manager, a middle-aged woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain, verified Emily's identification, checked the records, and led her back without ceremony. The box was medium-sized, not large. But when Emily set it on the table in the private room and opened it with the brass key, what was inside was not large in volume, but enormous in implication. There were documents, printed and organized into labeled folders, not handwritten labels but typed ones, which told her this had been prepared with the intention of being read by people who didn't know the organizational logic already. Financial records, account statements cross-referenced with the list from the cardboard box. A chain of transactions clearly documented, showing the movement of money from obscure Caribbean accounts through a series of shell companies into Meridian Capital Group. A timeline, year by year from 2002 to 14 months ago. And at the front of everything, a single cover page with one sentence typed in the center. For the people I trusted to know what to do with this. Emily stood in that room for a long moment with that cover page in her hands. Then she walked back out to where the 3 men were waiting, and she set everything on the table between them and said, "He finished it. He actually finished it. The whole thing." Jack picked up the first folder. His hands were steady, but his jaw was working. Reeves took the timeline. He read the first page and looked up. "He's been tracking this since 2004, he said. 2 years after Price got out. He started 2 years after Price got out, and he didn't stop." Ortega was reading the account documentation. He said nothing for 2 full minutes. When he looked up, his expression was the controlled one of a man who is managing a very large reaction very deliberately. "This is enough," he said simply. "This is more than enough. If the right person sees this, Price is done. Meridian is done. Halloran is done. All of it." "The right person," Jack said. "Denton." Reeves and Ortega both looked at him. "Frank Denton," Jack said, to Emily's questioning expression. "Former FBI. He left the Bureau in 2015, went into private financial investigation. He's the man I mentioned, the one in Denver. I spoke to him yesterday on the phone, gave him the broad strokes. He's expecting a call. Can he be trusted?" Emily said. "He put Price in prison the first time," Jack said. "And he's been frustrated for 20 years that Price walked out and rebuilt. Yes, he can be trusted." Emily looked at the documents, at her father's years of careful work laid out in front of her, at the 3 men around the table who had come back to each other after 20 years because Daniel Carter had asked them to, without being in the room to ask. "Call him," she said. Jack stepped outside to make the call and came back 11 minutes later with the compressed expression of someone who has received significant information and is deciding how to sequence it. "Denton wants everything scanned and sent to him by end of day," he said. "He has a contact at the Financial Crimes Unit of the FBI who has been keeping an informal eye on Meridian for the past 8 months. Nothing prosecutable yet, but what Danny built," he paused. "Denton says it fills the gaps. He says if this is what it sounds like, it's the connective tissue that ties the new operation directly to the old conviction. Price would be looking at a RICO charge, not just financial crimes." "RICO," Ortega said. He said it with a kind of quiet satisfaction. "For once the law is the right tool." "What does that mean for timing?" Emily asked. "Denton wants to move fast. The moment we hand this over formally, there's a clock running. He wants us to understand that once it's in federal hands, we lose control of the pace." "That's fine," Emily said. "My father didn't build this to control it. He built it to finish it." Jack looked at her. "There's one more thing Denton told me." His tone had shifted subtly, and everyone at the table felt it. Your mother, he said. Emily's breath caught. Denton's been doing this kind of work for a long time, Jack said carefully. I gave him her name yesterday when I called him. Sandra Carter, née Burke. I told him what we suspected, that Price had pressured her to separate from your father. He paused. He didn't need to do much looking. He already knew her name. The room was very quiet. Why? Emily said. Because Sandra Carter filed a confidential witness statement with a federal prosecutor's office in 2019, Jack said. She went in voluntarily. She documented what happened in 2007, the approach, the threat, the choice she made. She gave them names. Price's people who had come to her. Dates. Locations. He stopped. She was building her own case, Emily. Separately from your father. Neither of them knew about the other. They were both doing the same thing. In parallel for years. And they never connected. Emily stared at him. She's alive, she said. She's alive. And Emily pressed her hand flat on the table. She didn't leave because she wanted to. And she didn't leave and forget. She went to a federal prosecutor. In 2019, Jack said, which is the same year your father started the Flagstaff box. Same year. Emily. Different cities, different methods, same target. They were still fighting for the same thing, Reeves said quietly. Even apart, even not knowing about each other. Emily stood up. She needed to move again. She walked to the window and stood there, and she thought about two people who had loved each other and had been separated by force, and had each, alone quietly, stubbornly, refused to let it be the end, who had each picked up a different thread of the same rope and pulled. Where is she? Emily said. Her voice was controlled with visible effort. Denton is trying to reach his contact to find out if we can get that information. She was relocated after filing the statement and protective measure. He doesn't know if her location is protected, but he's going to find out. She might not want to be found, Emily said. If she's been protecting herself, she might not, Jack agreed. Or she might have been waiting, same as your father was waiting. Emily turned around. Her eyes were very bright. The same way he left me the box, she said, trusting that someday the right sequence of events would happen, that I would find you, that the case would be ready, that it would all. She gestured at the documents on the table. Line up. He planned 3 moves ahead, Ortega said, and for the first time his voice was rough. I told Ray that about him back in '91. I said Danny Carter plays chess when everyone else is playing checkers. I said that man is always thinking 3 moves past the move he just made. He looked at his hands. I should have trusted that more in '96. I should have understood that when he walked into that police station, he wasn't making a reckless move. He was making the right move. He was just the only one who could see far enough ahead to know it. The silence that followed was not an empty one. It was full of 20 years and roads not taken and conversations that had happened too late and one man who had done the right thing alone and then spent 2 decades making sure it would eventually matter. He trusted you anyway, Emily said to Ortega. Even after everything. You're in this room, aren't you? Ortega looked at her. Something in his face shifted. Yeah, he said roughly. I am. Then he forgave you, she said simply. He wouldn't have sent me to you if he hadn't. Our hours in Flagstaff. Reeves borrowed the bank's scanner, asking with a particular combination of authority and courtesy that large, calm men can deploy with great effectiveness, and scanned every document in the box. Jack coordinated with Denton by phone, walking through the organizational structure of the evidence while Ortega sat with Emily and did something that none of them had fully done yet. He talked to her about her father as a young man. Not the chapter years, not the political history, not the difficult things. The earlier things. The Ramon Ortega version, which turned out to be the most human version of all. He told her that Daniel Carter had learned to ride on a borrowed motorcycle that was 2 sizes too large for him and had refused to admit it was too large until he'd nearly put it through a fence, and then had sat on the side of the road for 20 minutes laughing at himself before getting back on. He told her that Daniel cried at movies and was deeply embarrassed about it and had a defense system that involved leaving the theater before the lights came up and claiming he had something in his eye. He told her that Daniel could fix almost anything: mechanical toasters, engines, plumbing, but was completely defeated by modern electronics, and once spent an entire afternoon arguing with a television remote that he could not get to work, and finally just stood up and changed the channel by hand with quiet dignity and never mentioned it again. Emily laughed at all of it. Real laughter, the kind that fills your whole body. And with each story, she got more of him back, not the myth, not the case builder, not the careful protector, just the man. The whole and human and sometimes ridiculous man who had been her father. He would have loved that you came looking, Ortega said, when there was a pause between stories. He would have put his face in his hands and then looked up and been so proud he couldn't stand it. You think so? I know so. He was always the most stubborn person about accepting help and the most moved when people offered it anyway. Ortega looked at her steadily. He raised you, Emily. Whatever you carry that's strong and whatever you carry that's stubborn, that's his. She was quiet for a moment. I carry things I didn't know were from him until this week. That's how it works, Ortega said. People leave more of themselves in you than anyone tells you. You don't find out what it all was until you need it. She thought about that, about the stubbornness that had driven 400 miles in a storm, about the patience that had kept her sitting through 6 hours of hard truth without breaking, about the instinct that had known the patch, had recognized it across a diner, had reached for it before her brain caught up. All of that had been there before she found the box, before she knew his story. He had given it to her without her knowing it was a gift. I want to know her, she said suddenly. My mother. If Denton can find her, I want to reach out. Ortega nodded. That's the right call. She might not be ready. She might not. But you've done harder things this week. He gave her a small, serious smile. You walked up to Jack Walker in a public diner and touched his patch. That's harder than a phone call. He's less scary than I thought, Emily said. Ortega glanced over at Jack, who was on his phone 30 feet away, with the posture of a man managing multiple serious conversations simultaneously. Don't tell him that. It'll ruin his whole thing. When the scanning was done and the files were transmitted and Jack had spoken to Denton a final time and gotten the confirmation that the package had been received and was being reviewed, the four of them stood in the parking lot in the midday sun, and nobody moved to leave right away. Ortega turned the key thing over in his hands, the actual brass key, which Emily had given him to hold for a moment because he'd asked to see it. He looked at it and then gave it back. What happens now? Emily said. Denton moves, Jack said. His contact at Financial Crimes reviews the package. If it's what he thinks it is, and he's confident it is, they fast-track it. Price doesn't know it's coming. He's been operating for 20 years thinking he was untouchable. He paused. That's about to change. How long? Weeks, maybe. Maybe faster. Denton moves when he has the right things in place, and right now he has the right things. Jack looked at her. Your father's work is going to do exactly what he intended it to do. Emily absorbed this. She looked at the key in her hand, and then at the bank building, and then at the three men around her. At Reeves, who had driven 3 hours without being asked. At Ortega, who had built a new life and walked back into the old one anyway. At Jack, who had opened a door he'd spent years keeping closed and had not retreated from anything on the other side of it. I want to say something, she said. The three men looked at her. I know you all carry something from 1996. I know you have your versions of it and your regrets and your whatever it is that makes men like you go quiet when you talk about a certain period of your lives. She held each of their gazes in turn. But I want you to hear this from his daughter. My father did not spend the last 20 years of his life angry at you. He spent them working towards something he believed in and trusting that you would be the people you actually are when the moment came. She paused. The moment came. You're here, all three of you. That's not failure. That's exactly what he thought would happen. Nobody spoke for a moment. Reeves looked at the sky. Ortega looked at the key in Emily's hand. Jack looked at her directly, the way he did, when he was receiving something that required receiving seriously. Thank you, he said, just that. He'd say the same, she said. He'd say it better. But that's roughly the content. Ortega laughed sharp and real. Reeves covered his mouth with his hand and his shoulders shook. And Jack, for the first time since Emily had walked into the Crossroads Diner 2 nights ago, smiled. A full one. The kind that reaches the eyes and stays there. They drove back together, Jack and Emily in the truck, Reeves and Ortega following and somewhere on the highway. With the afternoon sun coming in at an angle and the radio playing something old and low, Emily fell asleep in the passenger seat. She didn't mean to. It happened the way sleep happens, when your body has finally processed enough that it needs to shut down and rest quickly. Without negotiation, Jack drove and didn't wake her. He turned the radio down and he drove. He thought about Danny. He thought about the last time he had seen him in person, a brief, terrible interaction in a parking lot in Temp in the spring of 1996. After the night Jack hadn't shown up, after the message warning him off, Daniel had looked at him with an expression that Jack had filed under anger for 20 years, and that he now, with the context he'd been given over the past 2 days, understood had not been anger at all. It had been hurt. It had been the expression of a man who had expected better and had not received it and was deciding, very quietly, what to do about that. What he had done about it was build a box in a bank in Flagstaff and put Jack's name in it. He had done about it the most Daniel Carter thing imaginable. He had trusted Jack to eventually be better than the worst night he'd had. He had built the trust in, structurally, as a given, not conditional on an apology, not waiting for Jack to make it right before extending the faith. He had just left the faith there, in a box with a key, for whenever the world got around to delivering it. Jack blinked. He looked at the road. He thought about Emily asleep in the passenger seat, 20 years old. She had her father's eyes and his laugh and his stubbornness and his complete inability to be protected from things she had decided to know. She had driven 400 miles alone, and she had sat with 3 old, grieving road brothers for 2 days, and she had given them back something they thought was gone for good. He thought about what it meant to protect someone, how Daniel had understood it differently than Jack had, not as keeping people away from danger, but as making sure that when the danger eventually found them, they were prepared. Not shielding Emily from the truth, but building a pathway to it. Not keeping his brothers away from the guilt, but leaving them a way through it. That was the difference. Jack had been trying to protect himself from the guilt by keeping the door closed. Daniel had known, somehow, had known across 20 years and 200 miles of silence that what Jack actually needed, and find out what was on the other side. What was on the other side was this: a girl asleep in the passenger seat. 3 men on the same road again. Work that meant something, aimed at a target that deserved it, and the particular feeling that comes when you have been let back into something you forfeited, not by being forgiven, because forgiveness implies a transaction, but by being trusted as though the forfeiture had never happened. As though Daniel Carter had simply held the door open for 20 years and said, "Whenever you're ready." Jack was ready. He was 20 years late and he was ready. Denton called at 4:47 that afternoon. Emily was awake by then, sitting on the tailgate of Jack's truck in the motel parking lot with a can of soda and the afternoon sun on her face, while Reeves and Ortega ate sandwiches from the gas station and argued in the low-key, affectionate way of men who had been arguing for 30 years and found it comfortable. Jack took the call, standing 10 feet away, and Emily watched his face while he listened, because she had learned in the past 48 hours that Jack Walker's face was actually highly communicative if you knew how to read the small signals: the jaw, the eyes, the angle of his chin. His chin came up. She sat forward. He hung up. He came to the tailgate. He looked at all 4 of them. Reeves and Ortega had stopped arguing, and he said, Denton's contact ran the account numbers against an existing data set the Financial Crimes Unit has been building on Meridian. They match, not partially, completely. Danny's accounts are in their data set from a parallel investigation that stalled 2 years ago because they couldn't find the source of the funds. He paused. Danny's documentation is the source. It's the missing piece of their case. They had the destination. He had the origin. Put together, it's complete. Nobody spoke for a moment. They're moving, Ortega said. They're moving. Jack looked at Emily. Your father's work is going to a federal judge for an emergency review. Denton thinks an asset freeze on Meridian within 72 hours is likely. Emily set down the soda can. And Price? She said. Price won't know until it's already done, Jack said. That's how these things work, when they work correctly. By the time he finds out the case exists, the accounts are frozen and the documentation is in federal custody and there's nothing to destroy. Emily was quiet for a moment. She looked at her hands, at the key, which she was still carrying in her jacket pocket and could feel against her fingertips. My father worked on this for 20 years, she said. Yes, and it's going to take 72 hours. The groundwork took 20 years, Jack said. The rest takes 72 hours. That's how it works when the groundwork is done right. She nodded slowly. Okay, she looked at him. And my mother? Jack's expression shifted. Not to something bad, to something careful. The way you handle good news that might need preparation. Denton has a location. He has a phone number. He's authorized to share it. She's not in protected status anymore. The case she contributed to has been formally opened, so her protective arrangement has changed. He reached into his pocket and held out a folded piece of paper. Her number, her city. He paused, Bend, Oregon. She's been there for 6 years. She works at a library. Emily looked at the piece of paper in Jack's hand. She thought about a woman in a library in Bend, Oregon. A woman who had walked away from her daughter at age 7, not because she wanted to go, but because she had been told that going was the only way to keep her daughter safe. A woman who had, 7 years ago, filed a statement with a federal prosecutor and named names and demanded accountability. A woman who might be sitting right now in a quiet library not knowing that today was the day everything her ex-husband had spent 20 years building was going to land. Emily took the paper. She held it without opening it. He wanted me to find you first, she said. He put your name in the box, not hers. He wanted me to understand everything before I tried to reach her. I think so, Jack said. Because if I'd found her first, without context, without knowing what happened, I might have been angry in the wrong direction. I might have come in with the wrong questions. That's my read, Jack said. She looked at the folded paper. He thought of everything. He usually did, Reeves said quietly, from the edge of the tailgate. Emily opened the paper. She read the name Sandra Burke, her mother's name before Carter, the name she had apparently returned to, and the phone number. And below that, in Denton's printed handwriting, a single additional line. She asked about Emily in 2019 when she filed the statement. She asked if she was okay. Emily's eyes filled. She had been asked about. She had been worried over. She had not been forgotten. She folded the paper back up carefully and put it in her jacket pocket. Next to the key, not today, she said. I'll call her. But not today. She looked at Jack. Today I want to sit here with the three of you and know that my father's work is going where it needs to go and that it's finished. And then tomorrow I'll call her. That's the right call, Ortega said. Okay. She leaned back on the tailgate and looked up at the sky. Tell me more about him. Any of you. Whatever you want. I want more stories. And so they did, Reeves and Ortega talking over each other, interrupting and correcting, laughing at things that were funny and going quiet at things that weren't. And Jack listening more than he spoke, but speaking when he had something worth saying, and Emily sitting between them in the afternoon sun, taking in every word the way a person takes in water after a long time without it. At some point, Jack noticed that Emily had stopped looking up at the sky and was instead watching the three of them with an expression that he recognized not from her, but from the photographs in the cardboard box. It was the expression Daniel wore in the 1993 photograph, the one where he had his arm around Ortega's shoulders, the happy one. She looked in that moment completely at home. Jack looked away. He looked at the highway. He thought about Daniel Carter at 20. At 30 at the age he would have been now if the heart that had protected everyone around him had not given out too soon. He thought, I've got her, Danny. We've got her. You can rest. It was the closest thing to peace he had felt in 11 years. He didn't examine it too closely. He just let it be there, that warmth, that settledness, that sense of something enormous and long overdue finally falling into place. He let it be there, and he listened to Reeves tell the story about New Mexico in 1993, the one that apparently involved a very large misunderstanding, a borrowed truck, and a gas station in the middle of nowhere. And he listened to Emily laugh, and it sounded like something he hadn't heard in a very long time. It sounded like family. Emily called her mother the next morning at 8:15. She sat in her car in the motel parking lot with the engine off and the folded paper in her lap and her phone in her hand, and she sat like that for 6 minutes before she dialed. Not because she was afraid, or not only because she was afraid, but because she understood that this call was the last door. Every other door in the past 4 days had been pushed open and walked through, and what was on the other side had been hard and true and ultimately survivable. This one was different. This one was her mother. She dialed. It rang 4 times. 5. She was already composing the voicemail in her head, calm, clear, non-threatening, giving the woman on the other end every possible exit when the line connected and a voice said, "Hello." She sounded like someone who answered carefully, like someone who had learned to answer carefully. "Hi," Emily said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "Is this Sandra Burke?" A pause. Short but weighted. "Who is this?" "My name is Emily Carter." She stopped. Started again. "My name is Emily. Daniel Carter was my father." The silence that followed lasted so long that Emily pulled the phone from her ear to check that the call hadn't dropped. It hadn't. She put it back. Emily. Her mother said her name the way Ortega had said it, like something that had been kept carefully, like something taken out and looked at many times in private. How did you?" "It's a long story," Emily said. "I found a box he left me. I found some people who knew him. And someone named Frank Denton gave me this number." She paused. "I'm not calling to, I don't have an agenda. I just needed to hear your voice. And I needed you to know that I know. I know what happened. I know why you left. I know it wasn't." Her voice broke, just once, just slightly, and she held it. "It wasn't because you wanted to." The sound that came from the other end of the line was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when they have been holding something for 13 years, and it has just been taken from their arms. "I wanted to find you every day," Sandra said. "Every single day. I had to. The people, your father, there were people watching. And after I filed the statement, there were protocols, and I couldn't risk." She stopped. "You sound like him." "God, you sound exactly like him." "People keep telling me that," Emily said softly. Are you okay? Are you safe?" "Better than safe." Emily leaned her head back against the headrest. "The case is moving. Dad's documentation, it's in federal hands. Denton says Price won't know what hit him." Silence. "Then Danny finished it." "He finished it," Emily confirmed. Another long quiet. "Of course he did," Sandra said. And in her voice was 20 years of knowing Daniel Carter and being completely unsurprised by what he was capable of. "Of course he did. He never," she stopped. "He never let things stay unfinished. Not if he thought they mattered." "You mattered," Emily said. "We both did. That's why he did it." The sound from the other end of the line this time was unmistakably crying. Quiet, controlled crying, the kind of crying that belongs to people who have had a lot of practice doing it without letting it run away from them. Emily didn't say anything. She let it be there. She looked out through the windshield at the parking lot, at Jack's truck parked 2 spaces over, at the ordinary morning light falling everything and making it look uncomplicated. "I want to see you," Sandra said finally. If that's something you want. I understand if you need time." "Yes," Emily said. "No hesitate you. Tell me when." She told Jack first. He was at the diner across the road, the same diner she'd found him in 2 nights ago, which felt like 2 years ago, which felt like the beginning of a different version of her life, drinking coffee and not eating the eggs he'd ordered because they'd arrived wrong and he hadn't felt like sending them back. He looked up when she came through the door and read something in her face immediately. "You called." he said. I called. She slid into the seat across from him. She wants to meet. Next weekend. She's going to come here, not here specifically. Somewhere between us, she said. She'll drive down. How'd she sound? Like someone who has been waiting, Emily said. Not angry. Just waiting. She wrapped her hands around the coffee mug the waitress brought without being asked, and she sat with that for a moment. She said, Dad never let things stay unfinished. She said it like she knew it completely. Like it was the truest thing about him. Jack was quiet. She still loved him, Emily said. It was not a question. Some things don't stop because circumstances force them to, Jack said. Emily looked at him steadily. You never stopped either. He didn't answer. He picked up his coffee, but he didn't deny it. The case, she said, changing the angle. Denton called you this morning? At 7. Jack set the mug down. Asset freeze on Meridian Capital came through at 6:43 this morning. Federal court order. All accounts, all assets, pending investigation. He paused to let that land. Halloran is already lawyering up. Price, a slight shift in his expression. Something satisfied and hard-edged that belonged to a man who had been waiting for this specific word for a very long time. Price was served notice at his home in Scottsdale at 6:50 this morning. Emily closed her eyes for 1 second. 1 full second of allowing herself to feel it, the weight lifting, the years of her father's quiet, patient work finally colliding with the thing it had been aimed at. It's done, she said. The beginning of done, Jack said. There's a legal process. It takes time. But the structure is collapsed. The money is frozen. The documentation is airtight. He held her gaze. Your father built something that can't be undone now. Whatever happens from here, whatever Price's lawyers attempt, the machine is in motion, and Danny put it there. Emily pressed her lips together and breathed carefully through her nose. He did it, she said. He actually did it. He did it, Jack said, and you delivered it. She shook her head. We delivered it. He didn't argue. He just nodded once. Reeves left that afternoon. He had a job. He ran a trucking logistics company out of Kansas City, a legitimate and apparently successful enterprise that he spoke about with the modest precision of someone who had worked hard for something and wasn't going to oversell it. He had been away from it for 3 days, and that was the limit of what he could manage without things starting to slide. He said goodbye to Emily in the parking lot of the motel with the same directness he brought to everything. He took both her hands in his big ones and looked at her face and said, You come to Kansas City, you call me. I will put you up, feed you, bore you with stories about your father. That is a permanent offer. It doesn't expire. I'm going to take you up on it, Emily said. I know you will. He smiled, a real one, the first fully relaxed one she'd seen from him. You're Danny's daughter. You don't leave things unfinished either. He shook Jack's hand, that compressed, communicative grip, and he said something low that Emily couldn't hear. And Jack received it with a nod, and then Marcus Reeves got in his truck and drove north. Ortega was leaving the following morning. He had already called his wife, had already explained the broad outlines in the careful way of a man who has a good marriage and knows how to be honest with it. His wife had apparently said, according to Ortega, it sounds like you needed to do this, and then asked what time he'd be home for dinner, which was, Ortega informed them, exactly the kind of woman you built a real life with. That evening, the three of them, Jack, Ortega, and Emily, ate at the diner together. Real food, ordered correctly, no urgency. They stayed for 2 hours. They talked about everything and nothing the drive back. Ortega's shop, a motorcycle in Jack's garage that he'd been meaning to restore for 2 years and hadn't touched. Emily asked questions, and they answered them. And nobody reached for the heavy things, because the heavy things he'd been carried and set down, and what was left was the lighter version of the same people. At some point, Ortega looked at Emily across the table and said, What are you going to do now? After all of this, Emily considered the question seriously. I don't know exactly. I've been on the road for 4 days, and before that I was working a waitressing job in Denver that I care about very little. She paused. I think I want to go back and think about what I actually want. Now that I know, she gestured vaguely, all of this. Now that I know who he really was, what she really did. what all of you were. She looked at both of them. It changes things. Knowing where you come from. Knowing that the people who built you were the kind of people they were. It's a good foundation, Ortega said. It's a great foundation, Emily said, and she said it with the conviction of someone who had spent 4 days examining the architecture and found it solid all the way down. Ortega left the next morning. His goodbye to Emily was the longest of the three. He hugged her twice. The second time, because she initiated it, and he stood back and looked at her one final time with the expression of a man memorizing something he intends to keep. You know, he said, in 1993, the night of that Albuquerque run, Danny sat with me by the side of the road while everyone else was asleep. And he told me that the thing he wanted most in the world was to be a father. He said he didn't know how he'd manage it, given his life at the time, but it was the thing he wanted. Ortega paused. He managed it. Emily, whatever else went wrong, whatever it cost, he managed the part that mattered most. She couldn't answer that. She just nodded once and held it. He got in his truck and drove south. And then it was just Jack and Emily in the parking lot of the Sunrise Motel. And it was 8:30 in the morning. And the obvious next move was for her to get in her car. The tire had been properly repaired at a garage the day before. Jack having organized this with the quiet efficiency of someone who handled practical problems as a form of care, and drive back to Denver. She didn't move toward her car. He didn't say anything about it. I'm not sure how to do this part, she said finally. What part? The part where I leave. She looked at him. The part where I get in the car and go back to my regular life. Except my regular life is now completely different from what it was 5 days ago, and I don't entirely know what to do with that. Jack leaned against his truck. He understood what she was asking, underneath the words she was using. He had felt the same thing many times, the disorientation of a life that has shifted fundamentally and doesn't have a new shape yet. The road version of it was particular. You ride into something, and the riding changes you, and then you have to figure out how to carry what's changed back into the stationary life. You don't have to have it figured out yet, he said. The new shape takes time. How much time? Different for everyone. For me, usually longer than I'd like. She half smiled. Reassuring. It's honest, he said. She looked at the highway. I'm going to see my mother next weekend. Yeah. I'm going to call Reeves about Kansas City. He'll like that. And Ortega said anytime I'm near Tucson. He meant it. She turned back to Jack. And you, she said. What about you? What about me? Where are you? She asked it directly the way she asked everything. In all of this, what's the shape of it for you? Jack was quiet for a moment. The honest answer to that question was not simple, and he was a man who preferred not to give answers that weren't honest. I spent 20 years thinking I failed your father, he said. I spent 20 years with a door closed that should have been open, and a guilt I hadn't earned, and a version, the story that didn't have all the facts. He paused. And then you walked into a diner and put your hand on my patch and said, your father's name, and everything I thought I knew had to be rebuilt from the foundation up. He looked at her steadily. I'm still doing that rebuilding. Does it feel bad? No. And he sounded genuinely surprised by the answer, as though he had been expecting a different one. No. Feels like the road when you come out of a long mountain section and suddenly you can see for 50 miles in every direction. It's a lot to look at, but you're glad you can see it. Emily nodded slowly. Then she said, my father left me your name. He left me one name out of everyone he'd ever known, and it was yours. She paused. He could have left me Reeves. He could have left me Ortega. He left me you. I've been thinking about why. Jack said nothing. I think it's because you were the one who needed it most, she said. Not the one who'd be most useful, not the one who'd be easiest to find. The one who needed the door open from the outside because you weren't going to open it yourself. She held his gaze. He knew you. He knew what you needed, and he sent me. The silence that followed lasted for a long time. A truck passed on the highway. Somewhere distant, a dog barked twice and stopped. Jack looked at the ground, then at the sky, then at Emily, who was watching him with her father's patient, complete, unflinching attention. Yeah, he said finally. His voice was not entirely steady. I think you might be right. She stepped forward and she hugged him the same unself-conscious, initiating hug she'd given Ortega, except this one was different. Because Ortega had been her father's old friend, and Jack was something else. Something without a clean name yet. He had been her father's brother. He had failed her father once and carried it for 20 years. He had opened a door when she knocked. He had driven to Flagstaff and called Denton and made the calls and sat in the motel room and answered every question and kept every promise he could still keep. He hugged her back. It lasted exactly as long as it needed to, and not a moment more, which was also the Daniel Carter way. To do the right thing in exactly the right measure. She stepped back. Her eyes were bright, but she was not crying. I'm going to come back, she said. Not just passing through. I mean, I want to come back and spend real time. Learn that motorcycle in your garage. Hear more stories. She paused. Is that okay? The motorcycle is a 1974 Sportster, and it hasn't run right in 3 years, Jack said. If you can fix it, I'll teach you to ride it. Deal, she said immediately. You don't know how to fix a motorcycle. My father could fix anything mechanical, she said. You said it yourself. Toasters, engines, plumbing. She looked at him calmly. I have a foundation. Jack stared at her for a moment. Then he shook his head once, slowly, with an expression that was equally fond and exasperated, and which was, she recognized it now, the same expression he had probably worn 100 times across a diner table in Phoenix, when Daniel Carter said something impractical with complete confidence. Come back in 6 weeks, he said. I'll have the parts. She drove away at 9:15. Jack stood in the parking lot and watched her taillights until the road bent and took them out of sight. He stood there for a moment after she was gone, not because he was sad, or not only because he was sad, but because some moments need a second to finish before you move into the next one. He touched his vest, the patch, the worn, faded, stitched, and rest-stitched emblem that he had worn for 30 years through everything. He thought about the night Emily had walked across the diner and touched it with her trembling hands and said the words that had opened the door. He understood it differently now. He had spent 30 years thinking of the patch as a marker of belonging to the chapter, to the road, to the specific community of men who had chosen the same life. And it was all of that. But it was also something he hadn't fully articulated until this week. It was a marker of promise. Every man who wore it had made promises to his brothers, to the road, to a version of himself that believed loyalty was the highest currency. Some of those promises had been kept. Some had been broken and then, years later, in different forms, kept. After all, the promises that survived were the ones made to the right people. Danny had made him a promise in 1996, in the parking lot in Tempe, in the middle of a disintegrating world. I trust you. I still trust you. Not in words. In a look that Jack had misread for 20 years as anger and that had actually been hurt. And underneath the hurt, bedrock. The kind of trust that doesn't leave when it's wounded. The kind that waits. Jack had taken 20 years to receive that promise. He received it now. Fully. Completely. Without the weight of guilt around it, because Emily had taken that weight apart, piece by piece over 4 days, and shown him what was underneath. And what was underneath was not condemnation. What was underneath was exactly what Daniel Carter had left in a bank box in Flagstaff. On a cover page, in one quiet sentence, for the people I trusted to know what to do with this. He had been trusted. Through everything. Across all the years and the silence and the bad night, in 9,996 and the 2 decades of closed doors he had been trusted. Continuously, without interruption, because Daniel Carter had decided he was worth trusting, and Daniel Carter did not revise his decisions about the people who mattered to him. Jack walked back to his truck. He had calls to make. Denton wanted a follow-up. There was a detail about the documentation chain that needed clarification, and Reeves had texted at 7:45 about something he'd remembered from the Phoenix years that might be relevant. The day was full of forward motion, the way days are when something has finally moved. He sat behind the wheel and picked up his phone. Before he dialed, he looked at himself in the rearview mirror. He looked at the gray beard and the lines and the 20 years of road and weather and guilt and carrying. He looked like a man who had put something down recently, like a man whose shoulders were at a different angle than they had been 5 days ago. He didn't examine it too long. He just let it be what it was. He dialed Denton. 6 weeks later, Emily came back. She had given notice at the waitressing job in Denver, not impulsively, not without a plan, but with the careful ant of someone who has reassessed her foundation and knows which direction she actually wants to go. She had spent 3 days in a hotel in Santa Fe with her mother. She had not tried to fix 13 years in 3 days, because that was not something that could be fixed in 3 days, but they had started. Carefully, honestly, in the way of two people who are both stubborn and both committed, which was the Carter way, which was apparently also the Burke way, which meant Emily had always been entirely inevitable. Sandra Burke was a quiet woman with her daughter's stubbornness and her daughter's eyes, and the particular steadiness of someone who has survived the worst thing and reorganized around it. She cried on the first morning and then didn't cry again. And she asked about Emily's life with the focused attention of someone trying to catch up on 13 years in a weekend, and Emily answered every question. She brought photographs. Sandra looked at each one for a long time. On the last morning, Sandra held Emily's hands across the breakfast table and said, "He raised you right. I need you to know. I need you to know that what he did, keeping you ordinary, keeping you safe, keeping you out of all of it, that was not cowardice. That was the most deliberate kind of love I have ever seen a person practice." "I know that now," Emily said. "I know you do. I'm saying it anyway." Emily looked at this woman, her mother, the woman who had walked away to protect her, and then spent 13 years building a case to avenge her, and she thought, two stubborn people in love with the same third person, each working alone on the same impossible problem, each refusing to quit. "We're going to be okay," Emily said. Sandra squeezed her hands. "Yes," she said. "We are." She drove to Jack's place on a Tuesday, because Tuesdays had started to feel significant, the way certain days do when something important has happened on them. She pulled up to the machine shop, and he was already in the garage with the Sportster on a stand, which told her he had either been working on it for the full 6 weeks or had started that morning in anticipation. She suspected both. "You're late," he said, not looking up, by 4 minutes. Still late. She dropped her bag and came to look at the bike. It was disassembled in sections, the engine out and cleaned, the frame bare. He had done the teardown. He had left the rebuild. "You're serious," she said. "I told you I'd have the parts." He finally looked up. He looked at her the same way he'd looked at her in the diner, that assessment, that inventory, but what he was looking for now was different. Not whether she was really Daniel's daughter. He knew that. He was looking for whether the 6 weeks had been okay. "How's your mother?" "She's good." Emily paused. "We're in it. We're doing the work. It's not fast, but it's real." He nodded. "Denton?" "Price's lawyers filed 3 motions in the past 2 weeks," Jack said. "All 3 were denied. The asset freeze is holding. Grand jury convened last Monday." He set down the wrench he was holding. "It's moving." Emily put her hand on the bare frame of the motorcycle, feeling the metal. "My father would have liked this," she said, watching all of it move. "He would have found something to complain about," Jack said. "The pace, the process. Some procedural thing that he felt was taking too long." Emily laughed. "And then he would have gone quiet and done something about it." "Exactly." She looked at the engine components laid out in careful order. She thought about Ortega's story, the motorcycle too large, the fence nearly hit, the 20 minutes of laughter. She thought about a man who could fix anything and pass the knowledge on without knowing he was passing it on. She pulled up a stool and sat down next to the engine. "Okay," she said. "Teach me." Jack looked at her for a moment. At this 20-year-old woman in his garage on a Tuesday morning, with her father's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and 3 years of searching, and 4 days of revelation, and 6 weeks of rebuilding, all visible in the set of her shoulders and the directness of her face. He picked up the wrench. "We start with the bottom end," he said. "The foundation. You have to understand the foundation before anything else makes sense. That sounds like life advice, Emily said. It's motorcycle advice, Jack said. Coincidences happen. She picked up the manual he'd set on the workbench. She opened it. She started reading. They worked through the morning without much talking, the comfortable silence of two people focused on the same task. The kind of silence that belongs to people who have already said the hard things and don't need to fill the space with noise. Occasionally, he would explain something. Occasionally, she would ask a question that told him she was tracking the logic, not just the steps. Once she made a small error and he corrected it without comment, and she nodded and adjusted and moved on. At noon, he made coffee, and they sat on the two stools and drank it. I've been thinking, Emily said, about the patch. She looked at his vest, hanging on the nail by the garage door. What it means. What you told me about brotherhood and promises. She paused. My father never wore one again after 1996, but he kept the photograph of all of you. He kept the letters. He kept the key. He looked at Jack. He kept it all his whole life. I know. I think the patch was never the point, she said. I think the people were the point. And the patch was just the way of saying, these are my people, in case there was any doubt. Jack was quiet for a moment. That's exactly what it is, he said. That's the truest thing anyone said about it. He was still one of you, Emily said. Even without the patch. Even for 20 years. He was always one of us, Jack said. No hesitation. The vote in 96 was wrong. We all know that. The men who drove it know it too, the ones still living. A wrong vote doesn't change what a person is. He looked at her. Danny was my brother from the day I met him to the day he died. The paperwork on that never changed. Emily nodded. She looked at her coffee. Then I'm his, she said quietly. Whatever that means. Whatever version of it makes sense for someone who didn't live that life. I'm still his daughter. I still come from that. From him and from all of you. She looked up. That doesn't go away either. Jack held her gaze. No, he said, it doesn't. She went back to work. By 4 o'clock, the bottom end was assembled and torqued to spec, and Emily Carter had grease on her hands and the look of someone who has learned something true and useful, something that will stay with her. Jack checked her work carefully, thoroughly, without performing the checking, and when he was done, he said, simply, good. And she understood that from Jack Walker, good was not a small thing. She washed her hands and picked up her bag. Same time next week, she said. I'll have the top end ready, he said. She walked to her car. 3 steps, and she stopped. She turned around. Jack was already back at the bench, already looking at the next component, already in the forward motion that was his natural state now, not the static holding pattern of a man sealed behind a closed door, but the actual motion with direction and purpose and people to account to. She looked at him in his garage with his vest on the wall and her father's invisible presence somewhere in the oil-stained air between them, and she felt the thing she had been trying to name for 6 weeks settle into its name finally. The way things do when you've been patient with them. She felt found. Not by Jack, not by Reeves or Ortega or Denton or her mother. By all of them together, yes, but more specifically by the understanding that she had always been findable, that her father had always left her findable, had built the trail and left the box and written the name and trusted the right people and structured everything so that when the time came, she would be able to find her way to exactly this. A garage in Arizona, a disassembled motorcycle, a man who had kept every promise he could still keep. She had come looking for her father's best friend. She had found something her father had known. She would need far more than information or answer the truth. She had found the people who carried him, the people who would carry him forever, the people who had, by extension and by love and by the unbreakable logic of loyalty, been carrying her all along without knowing it. Hey, Jack, she said. He looked up. Thank you, she said, for not being who I was afraid you might be. He looked at her for a long moment. Thank Danny, he said. He picked better than he knew. She shook her head. He knew exactly what he was picking, she said. He always did. She got in her car. She drove away in the early evening light with the windows down and the warm Arizona air coming through and her father all around her in the road. in the people she was leaving, and would come back to in the grease still faintly visible at the edge of her thumbnail that she hadn't quite gotten off, in the knowledge of who she came from and what that meant, and how far it reached. Daniel Carter had spent 20 years working in silence, alone, keeping promises to people who didn't know he was keeping them. He had protected the woman he loved and raised the daughter he loved and built the case that would finally end the thing that had cost him everything, and he had done all of it quietly, without credit, without being seen. He was seen now, by his daughter, by his brothers, by a federal court and a frozen set of accounts and a man named Price, who was finally, irrevocably, out of road. And by Jack Walker, standing in a garage in Arizona with grease on his hands, and a vest on the wall and a promise kept 20 years late, but kept completely. Kept with everything he had, kept the way you keep a promise to someone who reached what past point where you deserved it and who turned out to be right about you anyway. Daniel Carter was seen and loved and finished and carried. His daughter drove into the evening and carried him with her, and she always would.